Well, now that you've looked at glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and electron transport system, let's put them all together. A lot of times that's referred to as cellular respiration or aerobic cellular respiration, often summarized with this formula. But I want us to get really the big picture well under control. And that is that we are extracting energy from our food to make ATP. And this alone doesn't do it. Let's try this sort of animated diagram to see if it helps you understand overall what's going on. So we have our food up here, which we're extracting electrons from, and each of these gears represent a different part of the cellular respiration chain, all driving the conversion of ADP to ATP. So it might look something like this. So I want to use this summary formula to sort of review all three major stages. But my problem with it written as is, when they just have that single arrow, is dramatically oversimplified, right? It's not just one reaction as I've kind of modified it here. It's a lot of reactions and pretty convoluted reactions at that. And then also, this only tackles a few of the molecules involved. There's so much more depth to it. I think one thing we could add to this that would dramatically improve it is some of the bits about energy. So for one, heat. Kind of note that heat leaves these reactions, just a byproduct of all this reaction. And obviously ATP. There's no point in breaking down glucose with oxygen if you don't make ATP. And I'm going to symbolize it as these reactions are driving another separate chemical reaction that makes ATP. We know there are several ways ATP is made, but we know that it's made out of ADP and a phosphate. Those have less energy, and they are then charged up by energy transferred out of these reactions into there. This is starting to look a little more complete and a good summary. We're extracting energy from glucose, we waste some as heat, but we get some back as ATP. Maybe we can even put some numbers on here, but that gets at the main idea. Well, let's start by looking at a summary diagram of the entire process. And first I want to track glucose and how it gets broken up into carbon dioxide. Well, here we have a shortened version of glycolysis out in the cytoplasm. And here's our mitochondria with the citric acid cycle and electron transport system. So in terms of glucose, starting over here on the left side, it's a 6-carbon molecule. We add some energy, split it in half again, so we end up with 2 pyruvates. Those go on into the citric acid cycle, and even before they enter the cycle itself, we split out a carbon dioxide, and as we move along, we cut out another carbon dioxide and another carbon dioxide. So before we even get to the electron transport system, all the carbon from glucose has been converted to carbon dioxide. All right, well, in this next pass, I want to take a look at oxygen and how it's used to form water. Well, once the citric acid cycle is complete, all these electron carriers pass their electrons off into this electron transport chain, and they move through there, but they have to go somewhere, so they're given to oxygen, which combines with hydrogen to make water. Well, lastly, let's look at the most important part. Where do we get our ATP from? So going back and looking over glycolysis, I'm going to put a couple of ATP in. I got 4 out, so I only got 2 ATP from that process. Down here in the citric acid cycle, all the way at the bottom, I got 2 ATP out of that for every glucose that came into glycolysis. The rest, we're going to have to look to the electron transport system. They used electrons. Those were given up to oxygen, but those created a hydrogen ion gradient, which then used ATP synthase to crank out ATP as hydrogen ions flowed back in, and lots of it. And that we get somewhere around 32 ATP out of that system. I wanted to, in an organized way, account for the energy containing molecules through each of our three major stages. I just do this because I never know exactly what's going to connect with people and be that missing piece that just links it all together and says, oh, now I get it, it makes sense. So let's try it, if this works for you. So glycolysis, let's track NADH production, FADH2, and ATP. Let's do that for all of them. So we got 2 NADH out of that one, no FADH2, and only 2 ATP. Citric acid cycle gave us a lot more of these guys. We got 8 NADH, 2 FADH2, and 2 ATP. My accounting is really just for one glucose molecule. If one glucose went in, what of these came out of it? We know the electron transport system is the big payoff, and so that used all of these guys, so we're at basically -10, right? We used all 10 NADH, we used all 2 FADH2s, and we used that energy to produce somewhere in the ballpark of 32 ATPs. So altogether, that gives us a total yield of 36 ATPs. Not too bad. This is just kind of a theoretical, calculated yield. A lot of times there's other stuff that happens, and so usually it's going to be lower than this. Although the interesting part is, you know what we could get out of a glucose? If you were just to calculate the amount of energy in glucose, and if we transferred all of that to ATP, we should get 94 ATP molecules. What happened to the rest of that energy? 36, that's terrible. That's like 38% efficient. You know where it went, right? Heat. Got left as heat. But it keeps us warm. And that's actually part of the positive offshoot of that. We use these reactions to stay warm because heat is a byproduct of virtually every chemical reaction. So we spent a lot of time tracking in cellular respiration what happens to one glucose. It all boils down to making 36 ATP. It seems all very theoretical. I don't know that I've ever eaten one glucose molecule myself. Usually I eat them in batches. So I kind of wondered, one glucose molecule, like what would that be in real terms? And so I thought about it, what about 1 teaspoon of glucose? We took a teaspoon of glucose, we did some back of the envelope calculations. How many ATPs would that give me? Call that a really big number. That's kind of my approximation there. A lot of ATP. So the amounts that we're talking about are so big, they're really hard to grasp. So it does kind of help to break it down into what happens to just one single molecule. Now multiply that out into a food-sized meal and spread it over 30 trillion cells. You see why this kind of reductionist approach can be helpful to start to gain an understanding. But we do need to broaden our perspective a bit and think we have a 2,000 calorie diet. Glucose is nowhere near that. And we eat other things other than glucose. What about starches and meat, protein, fats, all that other good stuff? What do we do with that? Well, that's the topic of the next lecture. Stay tuned.